All right, so picture this. When you hear college, what pops into your head? Is
Oh,
it like those iconic scenes from movies set at Harvard? Or maybe it's all the hype surrounding, the super selective universities.
right.
Well, get this. Community colleges are actually the starting point for something like half of all college students these days. And in many states, enrollment in these two-year schools is growing even faster than their four-year counterparts. It really makes you think,
Oh,
right?
it does.
It kind of flips the script on what we usually think of when we talk about higher education. Right off the bat, the key takeaway here is that the classic image of a college student and the traditional structure of higher ed, they're getting more and more out of sync with who's actually going to college today, especially at community colleges, which often fly under the radar.
Yeah, that's spot on. And the thing is, even though community colleges play this massive role, their experiences and the experiences of their diverse student body, they often get left out of the bigger conversations about higher ed.
Yeah.
The focus seems to always be on those more selective, the big name institutions.
Exactly. And that's precisely why we're diving deep today. We're going to explore Rebecca D. Copps's book, The College Fear Factor, How Students and Professors Misunderstand One Another. And what's so insightful about this book, I think, is that instead of focusing on those elite universities that grab all the headlines, Cox spent 5 years doing research across 34 community colleges.
That's really valuable. It gives you a perspective that's often missing on this huge part of higher education. By zeroing in on community colleges, the book gives us these crucial insights into what these students hope for, how they approach their education, and, most importantly, whether their actual college experiences are lining up with those expectations.
So our mission today is to really dig into the major findings from Cox's research. We want to understand the hopes, the challenges, and the dynamics for this incredibly diverse group of students, especially at community colleges. We're going to uncover some pretty surprising things about the anxieties they face and the often complicated interactions they have in their classrooms.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's start by looking at who today's college students really are, because the reality might surprise you.
It might. The traditional image of a college student, someone who goes straight from high school to a four-year residential college, full-time, no breaks, for 4 years straight. That picture, while it's still out there, it's actually representing a smaller and smaller part of the student population these days.
The numbers really tell the story. Even back in 1992, only around 52% of students entering four-year colleges fit that continuous single institution path. More than half were already taking different routes.
And that trend has only gotten stronger since then. Students today are way more likely to start at a two-year college, to work part-time while studying, to be enrolled part-time, and to transfer between different schools before they even think about getting a degree. It's a real shift in how students are approaching higher education.
And it points to a pretty big gap, doesn't it, between what students want and what actually happens. You have, on the one hand, these high aspirations. Something like 69% of high school seniors say they want to get a bachelor's degree. But then you look at the stats, and only around 28% of people between 25 and 34 actually have one.
Right. That's a significant difference.
Mm.
It shows the many roadblocks and challenges students face along the way. And unfortunately, as the book points out, those barriers disproportionately affect certain groups. For example, degree completion rates are lowest for people who have historically faced systemic disadvantages.
Totally. Data from 2000 showed that while 35% of white adults between 25 and 34 had bachelor's degrees, that number dropped to 18% for African Americans and only 10% for Latinos in the same age group. Lower income students also have a tougher time. They're less likely to even enroll in college and less likely to finish their degrees if they do.
Yeah, it raises serious questions about equity in both access to and outcomes from higher education.
Absolutely.
If you zoom out and look at the big picture, the expansion of the U.S. post-secondary system, well, it doesn't look quite as impressive when we compare it to other developed countries. Our overall percentage of adults with college degrees, both two-year and four-year, might seem relatively high compared to some countries in
In the OECD.
the OECD, right?
Yeah,
The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development.
which is basically a group of mostly developed countries.
Exactly. So compared to many of those OECD countries, our rate of around 39% looks decent. But here's the thing. While college enrollment in the U.S. has grown a lot over the past 4 decades, the number of college graduates has barely kept up with population growth. The percentage of adults with college degrees has basically stalled.
That's kind of a sobering thought, especially when you contrast it with places like Japan and Korea, where college graduation rates have jumped by over 30% in the same time period. It makes you wonder how well our system is actually working in terms of helping people get degrees.
That's a good point. And this brings us to the dual role of community colleges, which can be kind of tricky.
Yeah.
On the one hand, they're essential for making higher education accessible to more people. Lower tuition and less strict admissions policies mean more students can enroll, including those who might not have had a chance to go to college otherwise.
They really are gateways for so many, offering all sorts of pathways. Students can take courses that transfer to four-year colleges. They can get associate's degrees that are either for transfer or for specific jobs. And they offer adult education programs, too.
Right.
So, in theory, they provide multiple ways for people to advance their education and careers.
But there's a flip side to this. The book highlights what it calls a winnowing effect.
Yeah.
The high number of students who don't finish their courses or degree programs, it suggests that there are some serious barriers preventing many students who start at community colleges with the goal of transferring and getting a bachelor's degree from actually reaching that goal.
It's like a filter, right?
Yeah.
A lot go in, but not everyone makes it to the next stage. And the book argues that it's not just about individual students failing. There are underlying structural issues stemming from the conflicting roles that community colleges are expected to play.
What's interesting is the historical context for this. Even the early junior colleges, back in the early 1900s, had these contradictory goals. There was this push to democratize education and give more people access, but at the same time, leaders at big universities, like William Rainey Harper at the University of Chicago and David Starr Jordan at Stanford, were worried about keeping their institutions exclusive and prestigious.
So it's like these early community colleges were, in a way, meant to handle the growing demand for higher ed without, overcrowding those elite universities. They were supposed to divert some students, which kind of created a built-in tension. It sounds like they were set up to have these conflicting goals right from the start. How does that historical tension affect the challenges students face today?
That's a great question. This historical tension still influences the structural challenges community colleges face, which contributes to that winnowing effect. For example, funding models and how easy it is to transfer between two-year and four-year colleges, these things still reflect that historical separation, creating obstacles for students who want a bachelor's degree. Now, the book delves into a key factor that really impacts student success: the student fear factor. A central and maybe surprising finding from Cox's research is that community college students experience a lot of fear, and it impacts everything from how they participate in class to their aspirations for the future.
This was really eye-opening for me. Cox talks about this widespread fear, even among students who, on paper, look prepared for college. She tells this story about a student named Eva. Eva had good grades in high school, positive experiences with English, and a supportive family. But the moment her professor explained the course requirements, all those essays they had to write, Eva panicked.
And Eva's reaction shows that going to college can trigger a lot of anxiety, even for students who did well in high school. Melanie's experience also illustrates this shift. She was a serious student, knew what she wanted to do, but she immediately felt the pressure of college, the responsibility compared to high school. All of a sudden, the support systems, the clear categories, they were gone. She had to navigate this new environment mostly on her own.
And it's not just recent high school grads who feel this way. The book also talks about older students, like Colleen, who went back to school after raising her kids. Even with her life experience, she said college was really scary, a life-altering change. What's striking is that almost every student Cox interviewed said a college degree was absolutely essential for their future, but many of them lacked that, unspoken college knowledge that students from more privileged backgrounds often have.
And that feeling that college is so high stakes, that's what fuels this anxiety. Students really believe their whole future, their career, depends on getting a degree. So of course they feel a lot of pressure and uncertainty about their education and career choices. They're not just worried about passing a class, they're worried about their whole life trajectory, whether they're on the right path.
And the book focuses on how intense this fear is around composition courses. It's seen as this huge hurdle, like a gatekeeper to more advanced classes in different subjects. If you don't do well in composition, your whole academic journey could be derailed. It makes sense then that these intro writing courses have really high dropout rates, second only to math.
Yeah. Students like Kyra, who put off taking composition until her very last semester because she was so afraid of English, and Linda, who enrolled and dropped the same course multiple times, they showed just how deep this anxiety runs. Even students who said they had good experiences with English in high school still talked about feeling nervous on the first day of college-level writing, worried about the workload and the expectations. Jen, for example, felt completely overwhelmed by all the reading and writing.
It's interesting because students often say their anxiety comes from feeling like they weren't prepared enough in high school. Like Suzanne, who said she didn't have many formal writing assignments. But we've seen with Eva and Jen that even those who felt academically prepared still had a lot of anxiety about the demands of college. So maybe this fear factor goes beyond just feeling like they lack skills or experience.
Exactly. And this fear doesn't just go away once they start college. It often extends to worrying about transferring to a four-year university. Students like Nareda, Susan, and Sebastian all wondered if they were college material, if they could handle the work at a more demanding school. Even Sebastian, who felt confident at the community college, wondered how he'd do at a CSU or a UC, thinking it would be a big step up.
But there's some hope in these stories. The book also tells us about students who realized that their fears were mostly unfounded after they had positive experiences and got support from their instructors. Eva, Linda, and Jen, they all had experiences in their composition classes that helped them see they were more capable than they thought. Linda even realized she wasn't as bad at writing as she believed, and Jen's mom pointed out that maybe she just needed the right opportunity and instruction to really learn.
That's a really important point. If fear isn't addressed, it can be really harmful to learning and success. The book suggests that being afraid of failing can actually make students avoid being assessed and less engaged overall, which keeps them from discovering their own abilities and potential. So it's crucial to understand and deal with this fear factor to help students succeed. Let's switch gears a bit now and talk about what drives these students, their goals for the future, and how they see the value of going to college.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So, for most of the students Cox spoke with, the main reason they were pursuing higher education was to get better jobs down the line. They saw a college degree as the key to earning more money and having more financial stability, both for themselves and their families. Even Sebastian, who wasn't sure what major he wanted, hoped that taking general education courses at the community college would help him find a field that interested him and offered a decent career path.
And thinking about the future often involves weighing the immediate costs of college against the potential benefits, which might be bigger down the road. Students like Miguel and Yolanda chose to wait before starting college so they could take care of things like car payments or get some work experience before investing in higher education and hoping for a better income later on. They were making very calculated decisions about when and how to use their limited resources.
There's also a really interesting distinction the book brings up between getting an education in a broad sense and actually enjoying it. Take Joy, for instance. She knew her composition class was important for developing writing skills she'd need for other classes. She understood its value, but she straight up admitted that she didn't enjoy it at all. She called it a necessary evil.
Yeah, that's a very practical way of seeing higher education, and it's pretty common among the students Cox interviewed. They're focused on the concrete benefits, how their coursework will directly help their careers. And this perspective gets even more complex when you factor in the uncertainty of different career paths and the changing job market. Students like Joy, who switched majors because she was worried about low teacher salaries, and Sarah, who was afraid of spending years on a career she wouldn't like, they show this anxiety about making the right choices, given their limited time and money.
College is often seen as like a job certification for many of these students. Sarah, for example, thought that if she changed careers after getting a degree, it would somehow devalue the time and money she had spent on her education. That really shows how narrow a view some students have of a college degree. And the advising at her community college, where they pushed students to directly link their degree plans to specific jobs, kind of reinforces this limited view of higher education's purpose.
And efficiency, speed, those are really important for these students, given their busy schedules and financial constraints. Liz, for example, wanted to get it over with as quickly as possible. She'd had a bad experience at a different university where she felt unprepared and thought the teaching was bad. She basically said there was no point in learning anything that wouldn't directly help her career in radio broadcasting. It raises the question of what a valuable college experience really means to these students.
And then there's motivation. Sebastian, for example, felt way more engaged, interested in his college classes compared to high school, where he wasn't that motivated. For him, wanting to learn seemed to be tied to finding the material interesting and relevant to his life and goals, even in required courses that didn't seem directly related to a career.
But the book makes a good point. There are these two common approaches students take, getting the grade and getting it over with. On the surface, it might look like they're not engaged. But the book suggests we need to look deeper. Students might be very motivated in their own ways, focused on their own goals, even if their approach doesn't fit the traditional expectations of what it means to be motivated to learn.
So we need to understand what relevance means to students. How do they see the usefulness of their coursework? The book explores this through the question, how is that helping us? For many students, that question sums up their frustration with parts of their college experience.
Definitely. Students are always judging their courses based on whether they see them as useful and relevant to their goals. Mariella, for example, was really frustrated because different professors in the same composition sequence had different ideas of what good writing was. She couldn't see a consistent curriculum, so she questioned what she was learning and how it would help her later on.
It connects to Gerald Graff's idea that students are often thrown into a disconnected curriculum, where every instructor seems to have their own preferences and grading criteria, so students feel like they're constantly starting over. Mariella's question, so what is right, really captures that feeling of incoherence.
And Melanie's experience shows this too. She'd enjoyed upper-level classes in high school, like the relaxed discussions, but she admitted to checking out in college when she thought assignments were stupid or a waste of time. If she didn't see the value or relevance of an assignment, she didn't put in the effort.
So there's this constant evaluation going on in students' minds. Is this relevant to my life? Is it useful? How is this assignment helping me? And if they can't answer those questions positively, they disengage. Now, let's talk about how students see college teaching itself. It turns out their expectations of what should happen in class can be quite different from what professors intend.
That clash of expectations is a major theme in the book. Kelly's reaction to a roundtable discussion in Lori Brown's class is a great example. She immediately dismissed it as being too much like high school and said the professor wasn't really teaching us anything. For Kelly, college meant lectures, not discussions.
It shows this assumption that college should be totally different from high school. Kelly seemed to think that if there wasn't a lecture, there wasn't any real teaching happening. She had a very specific idea of what college teaching should be.
And Hugh's dissatisfaction with his history instructor also illustrates this. He felt the professor wasn't giving them enough expert knowledge or enough feedback on their work. He compared her to his high school history teacher, Mr. Dobbs, who was more authoritative. He clearly wanted a more controlled, knowledge-focused approach in college.
For Hugh, traditional classroom control and the professor showing their expertise through lectures, those things were tied to what he considered good teaching. He expected the instructor to create structure and deliver a clear body of knowledge. Anything less felt like a waste of time.
Right. And then there's the case of Lori Brown herself, who tried to create a more collaborative, student-centered classroom, but faced a lot of resistance from her students. They challenged her syllabus, asked tons of questions about assignments and grading, and questioned her teaching methods. The problem was, their expectations of what college teaching should be like clashed with Lori's approach. They thought her less controlling style meant she wasn't really teaching.
Maureen's experience provides a contrast. She really liked her government professor because he connected the material to their lives and current events, managed discussions well, and maintained control. For Maureen, the professor's ability to make the material relevant and guide the discussions was what made him a good teacher.
And Miguel preferred the structure of his math class, where nobody blurts out stuff,
Hmm.
to the more free-flowing discussions in his composition course.
Mm-hmm.
He seemed to want a more professor-led, orderly setting. Interestingly, the book also touches on how gender dynamics can play a role in how students perceive a professor's authority in teaching.
Yeah, the book notes that in Lori's class, which had more female students than male students, Miguel's comments seemed to imply he thought the women were talking too much, and that he preferred the male math instructor's more traditional style. It suggests that students might judge professors differently based on their gender.
Ultimately, the students in Lori's class found her expectations and methods confusing because they didn't fit their ideas of what college teaching should be. They wanted more guidance, more clear instruction, more demonstration of the professor's expertise. This really shows the misunderstandings that can happen when a professor's teaching style doesn't match what students expect. Now, the book offers some really interesting observations about how some effective professors manage to bridge this gap and, as one student put it, come down to our level.
This was encouraging. Cox looks at two composition instructors, Beth and Julie, who had high student success rates and were praised by their students. What was it about their teaching that made such a difference?
Well, there were a few key factors. First, Students trusted Beth and Julie's expertise because they clearly knew their stuff and could explain things well. Second, they built their authority on positive relationships with students, which many students found more encouraging than a more traditional knowledge-based approach. And third, while they had high expectations, they also gave very clear instructions on how to do the work.
So it's about convincing students they can actually do college-level work. Colleen pointed out that the professors who are most intimidating are often those who seem distant and unapproachable. Feeling intimidated can make students disengage, especially in writing classes where you want them to find their voice and take risks.
Beth and Julie understood this. They established their authority through their expertise and clear communication, but then they actively encouraged students and addressed their anxieties, meeting them where they were at and relating to them as individuals. Beth gave personalized feedback on tapes, and Julie gave very detailed instructions. Linda's point that instructors need to see things from the student's perspective is really important here.
The book really emphasizes how much influence professors can have on their students' confidence. If a professor underestimates how anxious students are, they can actually make those fears worse. Beth and Julie both assessed their students' attitudes at the beginning of the semester and then gave them lots of encouragement throughout. Beth used a survey to see how confident students felt, and Julie would often say things like, "You can do it, you will do it, don't panic."
That kind of encouragement helps students feel okay about making mistakes, because many of them said they felt belittled by feedback in other classes. Beth and Julie balanced their roles as experts with these strategies to reduce anxiety and create a supportive learning environment. Validation, acknowledging, and affirming students' abilities was key to their success, which connects with Laura Rendon's research on Latino students.
Right. Julie even believed that building students' confidence was more important than teaching them specific skills. She said, if I can convince them that they can do it, then they will. And students like Charmaine and Kyra, who became more confident writers thanks to positive feedback, show how powerful this can be. Even students who were initially afraid of English ended up feeling good about their writing after taking classes with Beth and Julie.
This success in bridging the gap between student fears and the demands of college shows that effective teaching, especially in places like community colleges with diverse student populations, requires more than just subject matter expertise. It requires awareness of students' anxieties and experiences and a conscious effort to create a supportive, encouraging environment. Now, the book shifts to a discussion of gatekeeping in higher education.
This part looks at how colleges and universities have historically controlled who gets access to higher education and who succeeds. In the early 1900s, for example, elite schools tried to limit enrollment of women and immigrants using things like mental tests to select students from the right backgrounds.
And while admissions processes are supposed to be more fair now, the book argues that some practices and assumptions still act as gatekeepers. These mechanisms can unintentionally favor students from more privileged backgrounds, not necessarily those with the most potential or drive.
And one big example of this, according to the book, is the idea behind intro writing courses, like first-year composition. The assumption is that one general course can prepare all students for all kinds of writing they'll do in different subjects. But the book, drawing on research and learning theory, says this is flawed. Academic skills, including writing, don't automatically transfer from one context to another.
That's a key point. Good writing is tied to the specific context it's used in. Learning to write well in a history class, for example, requires learning the specific conventions and expectations of history. A general composition course, while helpful, can't fully prepare students for that. As Beth, the composition instructor, said, it's hard for students to apply the writing skills they learn in English to other subjects like history or philosophy.
So this false promise of composition, as the book calls it, is a form of gatekeeping because it assumes a level of preparedness that many students don't have. And this can hurt their progress in other subjects. The traditional way of ensuring writing competence has focused on controlling who enters and exits the system through placement tests and exit exams, instead of changing the learning environment to better support writing development in specific subjects.
Exactly. The focus is on certifying competence at the beginning and end, not on actually teaching and learning effective writing within different disciplines. This leads us to the final and I think most important part of the book, which calls for rethinking the whole college experience, focusing more on understanding the needs of today's diverse students.
The book argues that when students don't do well, it's not just because they lack skills. It's also because there's a mismatch in understanding what college is really about between students and faculty. Academic literacy, for example, isn't just something you learn in class. It's developed both inside and outside the classroom, influenced by students' backgrounds and experiences.
And these mismatches in expectations, combined with student fear and anxiety, can really shape their experience and make it harder for them to engage in their coursework. The book found that successful students often benefited from instructors who made an effort to connect with them and address their anxieties.
But remember, fear itself can stop students from asking for help. Colleen was too intimidated to ask her philosophy professor questions, and Elisa was afraid to tell her instructors how behind she was. This shows how anxiety can prevent students from getting the help they need. And when students are confused about difficult tasks, especially if they don't have clear expectations from instructors, they can get overwhelmed and give up, like Joy did with that analysis paper.
And the book points out that many students have narrow definitions of college-level teaching and what's useful knowledge. This can clash with what instructors want them to learn. If students think only lectures are real teaching and only value knowledge that will be on a test, they might dismiss other valuable activities like discussions or readings that aren't directly tied to an exam.
And while motivation is important, the book reminds us that it's not always enough, especially when students are anxious and don't have clear expectations. Sebastian, for example, was pretty motivated, but not always fully engaged. And Melanie, despite wanting to succeed, ended up plagiarizing because she was afraid of disappointing her professor. These examples show that even motivated students can struggle because of anxiety and misunderstandings about college.
And finally, the book looks at institutional obstacles that can get in the way of creating understanding and responsiveness in the classroom. Faculty hiring and promotion often focus more on research than on teaching. The professorial paradigm assumes that good teaching is just about expertise, a clear curriculum, and capable students, which overlooks the actual work of teaching, especially in diverse settings.
There's also a tendency to connect the value of a program more with the status of its students than with the quality of teaching. And the focus on curriculum can sometimes overshadow the actual teaching and learning process. In the end, the way colleges and universities are structured can make it hard to share teaching knowledge, leaving instructors to deal with challenges and student anxiety on their own.
So, to wrap up our deep dive into the college fear factor, we've explored how community college students often experience significant fear and anxiety, and their expectations about college often don't match up with the reality. This gap can create obstacles to student success.
But the book offers hope, too. The success of instructors who addressed students' fears, created supportive environments, and connected with them on their level shows how important a student-centered approach is, especially for diverse learners.
This leads to an important question for you to think about. Given what we've learned about these fears and unmet expectations, what's one concrete change that could be made in higher education to better support students and help them overcome this fear factor? And how can colleges and universities shift their focus from exclusivity and prestige to the quality of teaching and learning in their classrooms so that they can truly serve all students? It's a challenge, but one that's worth taking on.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It was a pleasure.
And until next time, keep learning and keep questioning everything.